My name is Lynn Gillette. I'm the president of the Silicon Valley chapter of AAII, and we have a great program for you today. I want to extend a special welcome to those who are attending from the Eastern Michigan chapter and from the San Francisco chapter. There was interest in sharing this meeting, and so I thought that'd be a great idea. Uh, we will probably we're going to be over 100 in attendance today. So with your questions, please enter them on chat. Just click the little button at the bottom left of your screen and type in your question, and then the question, some of them will be answered as we go directly through it, and the others we can answer at the end of each of the presentations. Uh, anyway, just a comment for all of you, wherever you are in the US, your local chapter uh, could use some help. So if you'd like to volunteer, talk to your local board members and volunteer, because a lot of chapters lost leadership during the pandemic, and I know we've had a number of people step up and join and help, and that's really appreciated, and it really makes the chapter run more smoothly. This recording will be available roughly a week after the meeting, and we'll taking a break around 10:15 in that time period, and I'll also talk during the break about our coming events in May and September. So anyway, our speaker today is Christine Benz. Uh, she's one of the really articulate uh, educators in finance and investing for individuals. Uh, Christine is Director of Personal Finance and Retirement Planning for Morningstar. She also co-hosts a podcast on Morningstar titled The Long View, which features in-depth interviews with thought leaders in investing and personal finance. Christine is author of 30-Minute Money Solutions, a step-by-step guide to managing your finances, and author of a forthcoming book on how to retire, a very interesting subject. She's also co-author of Morningstar's Guide to Mutual Funds, Five Core Strategies for Success, a national bestseller published in 2003, and author of the second edition published in 2005. She holds a bachelor's degree in political science and Russian/Eastern European studies from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and is president of the John C. Bogle Center for Personal Finance. So let's welcome Christine and allow her to share her wisdom with us. Welcome, Christine.
Hi, Lynn. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for taking part of your Saturday morning out to be with me. I hope everyone's got their coffee. Hope everyone's got their taxes done. I do have my coffee, don't quite have my taxes done, but getting close. Uh, we're going to split this into two presentations. The first one will be about some work that my colleagues and I have been doing on safe withdrawal rates. We've been conducting this research annually for 3 years now and have come away with some conclusions, and I'll share them in the course of this presentation. Um, the presentation will be recorded, so if you'd like to refer back to it, you can do that. And I'm also going to share my slides with Lynn in case people would like access to the slides, they can do so. The second presentation in particular has a lot of detailed information about Morningstar's investment research and some specific stock and mutual fund and exchange traded fund picks. So you may be interested in seeing that presentation. And at the end of each of these presentations, I've also compiled a list of related links. So if you wanted to link through and see some of the research or see some of the items that I've referenced in the course of the presentation, you can do so. So Lynn referenced that I'm working on this book about retirement. It's called How to Retire. It's coming out in September 17th specifically. And it's a series of conversations with thought leaders about how to do some specific aspect of retirement planning. So I've got a chapter about withdrawal rates and a chapter about healthcare costs in retirement and another chapter about housing in retirement. And it's been a really fun project. I'll be very glad, I'll be honest, to have it finished, but it's been a fun project that I've been toiling on over the past several months. So I'll just start by giving look at what I'll cover today. I'll start by talking about why the safe withdrawal rate problem is such a hard one. Arguably, it's the hardest problem in all of personal finance, all of financial planning, and I'll talk about why. The short answer is that you're planning around a lot of very uncertain variables. And then I'll talk about five key lessons from our research on safe withdrawal rates that we've been conducting since 2021. So, the lessons in short are that beginning market conditions matter a lot. So, the state of equity valuations, the state of fixed income yields, the current inflation rate matters a lot. So, we'll talk about how to do a temperature check of starting conditions. We'll talk about the role of asset allocation when thinking about safe withdrawal rates. The somewhat surprising conclusion, shorthand conclusion, is that balance is really valuable. So, a lot of retirees do want to have a very heavy equity allocations, maybe stick with the heavy equity allocations that they used earlier in their accumulation life cycle. Our research points to the value of having a balanced portfolio when you embark upon drawdown in retirement. We'll talk about the role of inflation. Thankfully, inflation has died down quite a bit, but it's still an important consideration. So, if you're someone who is embarking on retirement at a time when inflation is high, the negative fact is that prices when you retire will just kind of build upon themselves. And that can make it important to make sure that your portfolio includes ongoing inflation protection. And we'll talk about how to do that. We'll talk about the variability of retiree spending over the life cycle. So I often say, and have concluded that it's a little bit of a straw man to suggest that someone is going to just spend the same amount throughout retirement. When we look at the data on how retirees actually spend, we see a pattern whereby spending does tend to trend down through the life cycle, and sometimes it kicks back up later in life, especially if someone has uninsured long-term care costs, and especially if they have hefty long-term care costs later in life. But I'll talk about how to think about real-world spending patterns and how that might influence your own starting withdrawal percentage. Because if you take into account that spending may trend down throughout the life cycle, that allows for a higher starting safe withdrawal percentage. And finally, I'll conclude by talking about some of the variable withdrawal strategies that we've tested, because much of the academic research, much of our research really points to the value of being flexible with your portfolio withdrawals if you can afford to do so, if you can put up with some volatility in your cash flows from year to year. That really redounds to the benefit of a higher lifetime withdrawal rate. So you can take more from your portfolio over the whole of your retirement if you're willing to be flexible, if you're willing to take less in a bad year like 2022 in exchange for being able to take a higher amount over the whole of the retirement life cycle. So I'll share some findings that we've come up with in that area as well as some kind of simple variable strategies that you can employ without having to do a lot of complicated and messy calculations from year to year. So I mentioned that I wanted to start by just talking about why this is such a hard problem. And the key one is because you are planning around uncertain market conditions. So here are equity returns through the past many decades, and you can see just a lot of variability. And we all know that stocks over long periods of time do tend to beat other asset classes, but there's a lot of volatility along the way. And you don't know at the outset of your retirement what specific performance to expect from equities. So you are planning around uncertain equity market returns. You're also planning around another difficult thing to forecast, which is just that inflation can be very difficult to foresee. So think about the recent flare up in inflation. I don't think many of us could have predicted the specific factors that conspired to kick up inflation, notably a pandemic, and then coming out of the pandemic and all of the pent up demand that we had for spending, some of the supply chain issues that we saw, all of the factors that combined to bring up inflation in this recent round of inflation. Prior to this recent bout of inflation, I think we had gone through this period where a lot of us began to kind of see inflation as a non-issue, something that was sort of going to be bumping around in the 2% range, really not a big factor. But this recent bout of inflation, I think, gave us all an appreciation of how difficult inflation is to foresee and just sort of the implications that it can have for our personal spending. Thankfully, inflation looks a little bit better right now, but it still should be part of your retirement spending plan. You want to factor in the idea that prices will go up, and you don't necessarily want to have to shortchange your quality of life because you didn't plan for some inflation. This is a slide that I think I'll forever have in my presentations about retirement spending. And it's just that people tend to not be great judges of when they might retire. So this is some research that was done by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, where they surveyed pre-retirees about when they expected that they might retire, and then came back to those same people to ask when they actually retired. And what you see is that there's a disconnect. So, for example, if you look at that 60 to 64 year cohort, well, when they surveyed the pre-retirees, just 19% thought that they would be retiring in that particular age band, so prior to age 65. What they saw was that fully 30%, or roughly a third of those same people, actually did retire in that period. So generally, people tend to retire earlier than they expected, and some of that may be for good reasons. Maybe the market has performed better than you thought. You've been able to save more than you thought. Your savings have amassed more quickly than you thought. That's a good reason, but there are a lot of things that can push people out of the workforce earlier than they might have expected. So health issues, spousal health issues, parental health issues. People may have a job that's just physically untenable, a job that requires physical exertion, and maybe their health just doesn't allow them to continue doing it. We know ageism is a thing in our culture, so people might have every intention of continuing to work and just may not be able to stay in that job for whatever reason. So a lot of factors can conspire against someone's plan to work longer, which is why I often get nervous when I'm talking to a retiree and they say, well, my plan is just to continue working until, some very specific date, way into the future, like until January 1st, 2029, or whatever the case might be. You may be able to, and certainly I think there's a lot of benefit to be had from continuing to work longer if you're up for it and you're feeling good and you're still engaged with your job. But there are just factors that sometimes are out of our control. So I often quote Morningstar contributor Mark Miller on this. He says that working longer is a worthy aspiration, but it's not a plan. I get nervous when working longer is a big part of how someone can make retirement work financially. It may not be tenable. So setting a retirement date is hard. People aren't especially good at it for a lot of different reasons. So we're starting
one question that came in.
Oh, sure.
Does the withdrawal rate include RMD? Currently, we don't need any extra money, but the government makes me take some. I don't foresee ever needing any of it.
Sure. So I will tackle that, but I'll just answer the question real quickly, which is that the withdrawal rate doesn't have to encompass RMD. It kind of depends on what you do with the required minimum distribution. So, I often say required minimum distribution is the amount that has to come out of those traditional tax deferred accounts now at age 73, but it's not required minimum spending. So you can reinvest those funds back into a taxable account in most cases. If someone in the household, if you or your spouse are working and have earned income, you can get the money back inside of an IRA, but it's not required minimum spending, so it doesn't have to factor into your withdrawal rates unless you want it to. The spending that I'm going to be talking about in the context of this presentation is money that you're actually taking and spending.
There's
So,
also, go ahead.
important clarification.
The next comment was just buy a QLAC with your RMD.
Yeah, so we'll tackle that. This is getting a little bit ahead of where I am right now in the presentation, but we can certainly talk about those qualified longevity annuity contracts, which are something that you can do with your traditional tax deferred accounts. You can put a percentage of or a certain dollar amount into the QLAC, and that amount that has gone into the QLAC will be deemed to satisfy RMDs. But I'll just stick with why setting a retirement date is so hard, and then we'll get into some of those nitty-gritty questions about distributions and about some of the tax implications of those distributions. So we're starting to see the wild cards stacking up. We have uncertain stock and bond returns, so we're trying to figure out what those might be over a very long time horizon. We're not sure about the trajectory of inflation over our specific retirement time horizon. We may not be great about setting our own retirement date, and retirees' own spending patterns are in the mix, that retirees don't necessarily spend in a straight line. And finally, the elephant in the room in this discussion about safe withdrawal rates is that we don't know with any certainty about our time horizon. As we get into our 60s and beyond, we probably have some sense of what our health is. We may be able to use family longevity to help give us a guide about how long of a retirement to plan for. But I'm sure we've all known very healthy people in our lives who have suddenly had some, catastrophic health incident later in life, and it was completely unexpected. So life expectancy is the big wild card and makes this such a difficult planning problem because you're planning for an uncertain, unknowable time horizon. So what do we know with some degree of certainty about retirement spending? Well, let's just take these one by one. This is a slide that I've included in a lot of presentations over the years, but this looks at two hypothetical retirements. The one on the left side is the actual sequence of returns. So someone who was retiring in the early 1970s with a $500,000 portfolio that was split 50-50 between stocks and bonds. Well, that was sort of the worst of all worlds in terms of retirement time horizons, because you had a bad equity market shock in 1973, 74. You had very high interest rates that declined over that time horizon. So I'm sorry, reverse that. You had a bad bond market because the Fed stepped in to try to stave off inflation. So you had high inflation at the outset. Pretty much everything that could have gone wrong for a new retiree during that particular decade of the early 1970s through early 1980s did. And so that retiree ran headlong into a bad market environment, and spending 5% of that 50-50 portfolio, that person would have been out of funds within a 20-year period. So we think of that as kind of a retirement fail. You don't want to run out of funds within a 20-year period. You typically would want to plan for a 30-year horizon, or at least a 25-year horizon. So that was a bad outcome simply because the withdrawal rate was too high in a period when the retiree encountered really a bad sequence of returns early on in retirement. The right-hand side of the slide depicts what if we flipped market conditions. So we had the really great equity market returns and the declining yields that persisted in the late 1980s, early 1990s, if those occurred at the outset of the period, what you can see is that with exactly the same raw materials in terms of the portfolio, so the same 50-50 equity bond allocation, the same $500,000 portfolio, the same 5% spending rate, that retiree not only had more than enough money over that 20-year time horizon, but actually managed to grow that portfolio over that period. So it's really just luck of the draw, the specific market conditions that prevail over our in retirement time horizon. We might have a little bit of wiggle room to determine when we retire, but many of us don't want to put off retirement for, say, 5 years. So beginning market conditions are super important, and kind of doing a temperature check on market conditions at the outset of your own retirement is important. This slide is kind of picks up on what we were just looking at, where if you take the starting safe withdrawal rate over various time periods, you can see that it moves around. So each little dot on these graphs represents what would have been a starting safe withdrawal percentage for whatever equity bond allocation is depicted on the slide. So if we look at that high point there in the 1950s, for example, or it's sort of in the late 1940s, it looks like. So you can see that dark blue line, that 75%, 25% bond portfolio would have supported a 10% starting safe withdrawal rate, because that person hit things exactly right, where you had a really strong equity market in the post-World War II environment. So it would have supported a really high safe withdrawal amount for that very lucky retiree with a very equity heavy portfolio. When William Bengen did his research on safe withdrawal rates, he homed in on that period that I've circled there in red, where the idea is that that particular retirement time horizon was not so great for retirees. I mentioned bad equity market. You had rising interest rates, which hurt bond prices. You had high inflation, pretty much everything that could go wrong for retirees during that specific time period did. So it really didn't matter what sort of asset allocation you had. You can see that the high equity portfolio, the low equity portfolio, nothing really gets you above a starting safe withdrawal percentage of 4%. And that's where Bill Bengen anchored on that 4% guideline that we often talk about, where if you look over market history, you can see that if you want to be safe, if you want to plan for the worst case scenario, you would need to think about kind of a 4% starting safe withdrawal rate. But thinking about the specific market conditions that might prevail over your time horizon, using what we know about equity valuations and what bond yields say about future bond prices and where inflation is, kind of homing in on those things really makes a difference and can help influence what sort of withdrawal rate might be safe over the ensuing 25 or 30 years. So on your dashboard, if you're thinking about market conditions, thinking about how those might influence safe withdrawal rates, you'd want to be thinking about sort of the ideal conditions would be very low equity valuations. So you're selling stocks into a rising market. That's a good thing to do. You'd want bond yields and cash yields to be decent, at least, maybe in line with historic norms. When you think about a couple of years ago, prior to 2022, when rates started to go up and get a little closer to historical averages, rising or very low yields were a negative for new retirees because they just couldn't count on much from the safe portions of their portfolios. That's gotten better. Low inflation, obviously, is another plus. And then the opposite would be true when you think about things you'd want to be a little bit spooked about and you'd want to be conservative in terms of your withdrawal rate. high equity valuations, very low cash and bond yields, high inflation. Those would all be risk factors and reasons to potentially rein in your withdrawals, your starting percentage. If conditions look more like that, more like 2021's, you'd want to be more conservative. So let's take a look at where we are today generally, and I'll cover some of these themes in depth in the next presentation, but we'll just touch lightly on sort of how I would be thinking about market conditions today. So when we look at equity valuations today, this is just a shot of our price to fair value graph on Morningstar.com. Kind of fair. They were very, very attractive at the outset of 2023, prior to last year's great rally. Today, when we look at our price to fair value for the total market, which is based on our analysts' price to fair values for the companies in their coverage universe, we see sort of a fairly valued picture. I think you can drill in and find cheaper segments of the market, but if you're just owning like a total market index or a global total market index, you have just sort of okay market valuations. Not terrible, not great. This just adds a little more nuance to that picture when we drill into specific market segments. You can see that you can find pockets of opportunity. So if your portfolio has more discrete exposures to, say, value stocks or small cap stocks, our research would suggest that kind of tilting in that direction would argue for sort of better returns going forward by getting yourself into more attractively valued stocks. And again, I'll delve more deeply into this in the next presentation, which focuses more specifically on stock picking and kind of thinking about how to rebalance your portfolio. Another thing, so if equity valuations are just sort of okay, bond yields are looking much, much better for new retirees. So this is just global bond yields on sovereign bonds across the globe, major developed countries. You can see that, even little Japan, not little Japan, huge Japan, but Japan had been toiling with such low yields for so long, yields have actually begun to tick up there. So across the globe, bond yields are lifting, and that just creates a lot more certainty around future bond returns because there's a very tight linkage between today's starting yields and the subsequent return that you're likely to earn from bonds over the next decade. So if we're like in the 5% range, 4.5%, 5% range from high quality bonds today, that means that you can roughly expect a similar return over the next decade because your yield tends to be the bulk of the return that you earn as a bond investor. So this is just a slide that I pulled from a article that I do every year where I pull together all these capital markets forecasts from various investment firms, including Morningstar. And the idea is that, just to kind of survey where sentiment is, where firms are thinking equity market returns and bond returns will be over the next decade. The right-hand side of the slide shows pretty tight consensus around the idea that bond returns will be in the 4 to 5 to 6% range over the next decade, kind of depending on time period and which particular cut of the bond market. But in general, firms do very much believe and data support that there's a tight linkage between starting yields and subsequent returns from bonds. So the implications for starting safe withdrawal amounts, this is based on our 2023 research on this topic. When we did the research in 2021, our starting safe withdrawal percentage was 3.3%. It ticked up to 3.8% in 2022. When we reran the data in 2023, we came out with 4% being a safe starting withdrawal percentage. And the key reason that it bumped up in the 2023 research was the fact that bond and cash yields look so much better and that inflation had abated a little bit relative to 2022. When we were running the research in 2022, inflation was still quite high. So we were assuming an elevated inflation rate over that 30-year period. When we looked on the research for 2023, we're able to use a somewhat lower inflation number. Before I go any further, I just want to discuss kind of the convention that we use around talking about safe withdrawal percentages. So we have what we call kind of a base case for this, and we're assuming that someone wants kind of a paycheck equivalent in retirement. So you basically are saying that we want to give the person a fixed real percentage withdrawal, and then we'll just inflation adjust that dollar amount throughout retirement. So to use a simple example, using our 4% guidance, if you had $1 million portfolio and you wanted to take our research to heart, you could take 40,000 out in year one of retirement, and then you just inflation adjust that dollar amount thereafter. So if inflation is 3% in year two of retirement, you could take $41,000 and change on down the line. We're not saying that if 4% is a safe starting withdrawal percentage, it's not saying that you would just take 4% in perpetuity. That would tend to make you really beholden to whatever's going on in your portfolio, probably uncomfortably so. So the assumption here is that someone wants more or less a static spending rate from his or her portfolio. That may not jibe with the reality, but that's the assumption that we use for our base case. So just to make sure that everyone's on the same page with that before I go any further.
There's two questions that came in
Sure.
about bonds.
Okay.
Individual bonds, not bond funds, and short or 30-year.
Okay. So the in the return assumptions that I shared, that's just sort of an aggregate bond, sort of looking at like a Barclays aggregate index. That's what it appears on that slide. In terms of individual bonds versus bond funds, I tend to be more on team bond fund or team bond ETF versus individual bonds, simply because it's really difficult as a small investor to amass a portfolio of individual bonds that I think is adequately diversified. So I would tend to gravitate to a bond fund. The big disadvantage of bond funds, of course, we saw in 2022, which was that you can have these price dislocations in bonds where if you need your money from the bond fund in 2022, you will not necessarily be made whole on your purchase of that bond fund. Which is one reason why I think it's super important to hold bond funds of different maturities in your portfolio. So I think you should have cash for one thing, but also hold bond funds of different maturities. So hold short-term bond funds, hold intermediate-term bond funds. I'm not sure anyone really needs a long-term bond fund because the volatility is so high and kind of unbond-like, in my opinion. But I would definitely hold an array of bond funds with different maturities. But I just really think that the all-in-one diversification, the professional management that you get with a bond fund, even if it's an index product, to me, that's money well spent. And bond fund expense ratios are typically a lot lower than equity fund and expense ratios. So I tend to think that individual bonds are a lot of work, and small investors may actually encounter trading costs that large institutional investors and funds will not. So my bias is more toward a fund for simplicity. And I would say I have a general bias toward simplicity for investors, especially as we all get older. Monkeying around, I think, with fewer moving parts in a portfolio is a worthy goal. So that's a good question. Was there another question on bonds?
There is.
Okay.
On a previous slide, Venncard had two numbers on the slide. And I don't know which slide.
I don't see one with like two numbers.
One before,
If they want to resubmit a question, maybe to
you can
give
go
me a
back
little
one
more.
slide.
Back
Sorry,
one more slide.
this one.
Yes, this one.
So
This
what,
Vanguard has a two number, like a 4.2 and 6.2.
Yeah, Vanguard supplies a range for its capital markets assumptions, which actually I think is uh, probably a sensible way to go because it doesn't sort of uh, make it seem falsely precise. So Vanguard's estimates are all in a range, whereas other firms all supply a specific pinpoint sort of return forecast.
Thank you.
Sure.
And then one more came in. What about the
Okay.
use of California tax exempt bond fund or ETF?
Yeah. So the question about municipal bonds versus taxable bonds really depends on where you're holding the account. So if you are, holding bonds in a tax sheltered account like your IRA, you really wouldn't probably want to hold municipal bonds because the yields are typically less. The benefit of municipal bonds does come into play for taxable accounts where pick up a federal tax break, and if the bond is issued or the bond fund is issued, but if the bond fund is composed of bonds issued by your home state, well, you earn that state tax break as well. So it really depends on your tax bracket, the appropriateness of the munis. You can find these tax equivalent bond calculators. I think Fidelity has a good one on its website where you can plug in the attributes, specifically the yield of say you're comparing a taxable bond fund to a California muni fund. You can compare the yields. You can plug in your tax rate, your federal tax rate and your state tax rate, and come out with a little bit more of a sense of whether the municipal bond fund is the better bet than the taxable bond. Oftentimes in a taxable account, especially if you live in a high tax state like California, the municipal bond will be the better bet, but run the numbers. My husband and I do hold municipal bonds. We also hold a municipal money market account in our taxable account, especially with yields going as high as they are today. Sort of a shoulder shrug a couple of years ago when yields across the board were so low. But now that yields are higher, it's more meaningful, and the tax bill that you'll owe on those higher yields are also more meaningful. So good question there.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. So we talked about how starting conditions matter a lot when you're thinking about safe withdrawal rates. Asset allocation also matters a lot. So this is a slide that looks back in history at various asset allocations just to see what would have been the highest safe withdrawal percentage that would have been supported over various periods. And you can see, the gut reaction might be, well, wouldn't 100% equity always be best? Well, certainly if you hit it exactly right, yes, having a very high equity allocation would have been your ticket to, there on the slide, a 7% starting safe withdrawal percentage. But if you hit it exactly wrong, there you can see that you would have had to make do on a 1.7% starting safe withdrawal percentage if you wanted the funds to last over a 30-year time horizon. So I think the key takeaway when you look at this slide is that there is value in balance. So you can see that with that 50-50 portfolio in the middle of the slide, the worst starting safe withdrawal percentage would have been 3.4%. At the high end, you would have been close to 7%. So you would have been close to getting what that 100% equity investor would have had. So this argues for, at least looking historically, that balanced portfolios are probably where you'd want to be versus that portfolio that's entirely in equities. But we'll just dig into this a little bit. So this is based on our research that we've run recently, where we're incorporating some assumptions about future stock and bond returns to help drive how much someone could safely take out of portfolios with various asset allocations. So I'll just describe what we're looking at here. This is using that base case assumption. So assuming that someone wants to figure out, well, what percentage could I take initially, and then inflation adjust that dollar amount thereafter. And if you look on that 30-year column, for example, that's assuming a 30-year time horizon, you can see the starting safe withdrawal percentage that each of these asset allocations would support. And our research homed in on that 4% number, which somewhat surprisingly to us corresponded with portfolios with just between 20% and 40% in stocks, which is really low. I personally plan to have more in stocks in my portfolio than that when I embark on retirement. But our research, basically the Monte Carlo simulations that we run, gravitate to the higher safe yields that are now available and this very safe spending system that we're asking for. So we're just sort of asking for this paycheck equivalent throughout retirement. Our system homes in on, okay, if you want that very stable cash flow for 30 years, let's get some of these higher yields that are now available in bonds and in cash, and let's lighten up on stocks. So that's kind of an interesting takeaway. And another factor is just that our outlook for equities, it's reasonable, but it's not as high as it would have been, say, at the outset of 2023. So we'll just dive into some of the assumptions that we use. And again, we're attempting to be forward-looking. We're not just plugging in backward-looking return expectations. We're using our Morningstar Investment Management's team's forward-looking forecasts of stock and bond returns as well as inflation. And so what you can see is that our team definitely thinks over a 30-year horizon that stocks will have a higher return than bonds. So you can see they're in the realm of anywhere from 9 to 13%, depending on the specific subcategory of equities, whereas the bond return expectations are in the neighborhood of 5%. But the thing that our Monte Carlo simulations home in on is that standard deviation column, the volatility column in the right-hand side of the slide. And basically our simulations say, well, yes, those bond returns are lower, but they're also much more stable. They're less volatile. That's just a source of certainty. If you're telling me that you want kind of that $40,000 inflation-adjusted paycheck or whatever, the 4% works out to be with a specific portfolio, we need to have some of this safe stuff in the portfolio. So I think that that's kind of the rationale for why our starting safe withdrawal percentage, the highest one, corresponds with a fairly low equity allocation. But I would also say that many retirees will want more equities just as long as they understand some of the trade-offs, because there are trade-offs with that very sort of non-variable system of taking withdrawals that I discussed. There's just a little shout out for this bucket approach that I often talk about and write about, because inherently it's a balanced strategy. Because it is assuming that you're holding some cash in bucket one to cover you for a couple of years worth of living expenses. You're holding some fixed income assets in bucket two, and then for years 11 and beyond of your retirement, you're holding equities. But it's inherently, when you kind of run the numbers on most retirement portfolios, it gives you sort of a balanced asset allocation. This is just a sample in retirement bucket portfolio. And I have a lot of different versions of these on Morningstar.com. They're all part of our free website. So it's not part of our paid service, where you can just see some of these sample bucket portfolios. But you can see here you've got a couple of years worth of living expenses in cash investments. And the idea is that it is going to cover you for like a 2022 type scenario, where your stocks are down, your bonds are down at the same time, while you have cash to pull from in a year like that. And then bucket two is largely a fixed income portfolio, high quality complexion. It will have down years like 2022, but it'll tend to out earn that cash portfolio over time. And then the growth engine of the portfolio is that bucket three, that is, for many new retirees, will be the bulk of their portfolios. But the balance is in buckets, a sensibly constructed bucket portfolio will tend to be a balanced portfolio.
There's two questions.
Oh, sure.
So the 20 to 40% allocation does look low, but do you think the yield today is why the shift from 50-50 or a 60-40 allocation?
Yeah, so the good question, and the observation is exactly right, that the fact that yields are higher today portends fairly high returns from fixed income investments over the next decade, whether you're in a bond or individual bond or that you're holding to maturity or a bond fund, you probably will have returns in the neighborhood of that starting yield. So yes, that is why our system gravitates to that fairly low equity allocation, because it's basically able to button up a lot of the return that we're looking for in safer assets without a lot of volatility attached to them. So good question and astute observation. That's exactly what's going on there.
The target date funds are using much higher international stocks. Vanguard uses 60/40 of the US to international stocks, I think. Are you thinking this and limiting international stocks to 20%?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. We have a slightly different philosophy on the international equity allocation at Morningstar, where we think that young investors, and my gauge of what's young is kind of changing. I would say like anyone under 50 might want to think about sort of the global market capitalization as a means of determining how much to hold overseas. So I think right now maybe the US market is in the neighborhood of like 55%, maybe even 60% of the global market cap, with non-US stocks as the remainder. So we think that's a good place for people to start out. But as you get closer to retirement, and certainly in retirement, the currency fluctuations that you have with non-US is just kind of a wild card that you don't need, especially when you're planning to actively spend from that portfolio in US dollars. So we have kind of a glide path of US versus non-US that tends to taper down for people as they age. I think you still want plenty of non-US in your portfolio. I certainly intend to maintain sizable non-US exposure, especially because it seems like non-US is inexpensive relative to US, although I've been saying that for a few years, hasn't really unwound itself. But I think that you'd maybe want to back off the like full global market cap sort of allocation and shift toward a slightly lighter non-US allocation, if that makes sense, as you get close to retirement and in retirement, if that answers the question.
There's one more question that came
Sure.
in. How do you decide order of withdrawal from the buckets and replenishment?
Oh, it's such a good question. So I have a whole presentation on the bucket strategy, but the basic idea is that every year you're kind of taking a step back and looking at what has gone on in the portfolio. So in a year like 2022, you're pulling from cash, right? Because your stocks probably didn't go up, your bonds certainly didn't go up. And so your best source of funds would be your cash investments. In many other years, like in a 2023, for example, you're maybe using a combination. You might be using a combination of the organically generated yields from your fixed income and cash investments, which have thankfully gotten higher. And then potentially, if you need additional spending above and beyond what you're getting from those income sources, then maybe you would pull some appreciation from your equity portfolio. So that's kind of a good year for stocks when you would do that. In other years, like 2021 would be a good example, where bond yields weren't much, so you'd probably just sort of leave those alone. Equities performed really well, so you'd probably pull from appreciated equity holdings and use that to supply your cash flow needs. So that's what I like about the bucket strategy, is that it's just flexible, it's not dogmatic, and it's giving you the opportunity in a really bad year for stocks and bonds to just reinvest your yields back into those holdings. So, think about 2022. I mentioned that was a year where you'd be pulling from your cash holdings. In that year, you would be just reinvesting your income distributions back into those fixed income holdings to kind of put money to work at a time when fixed income securities were down in the dumps. So I like the flexibility that's inherent in the bucket approach. That's
So
one of the
you,
reasons I'm a believer.
does that mean that you do not automatically reinvest dividends?
It really depends on the investor in terms of the approach to dividends. The thing I've really warmed up to is kind of a hybrid approach where the retiree is using the dividend distributions from equities to the extent that the equities have dividend distributions. They're using the fixed income distributions to provide an element of cash flow needs, and then using rebalancing proceeds for the remainder of cash flow needs. Some retirees might be sort of pure total return, just reinvest those distributions back into the portfolio and just use rebalancing to help replenish that cash bucket. I think that's a fine way to do it too. It really just depends on the retiree. I tend to think behaviorally, it provides comfort to at least have your spending supplied from those yields, but there are years like 2022 where you'd probably want to be reinvesting them back into the portfolio.
Thank you.
Okay. So we'll just go forward here. I want to touch on inflation. It's not as front burner an issue as it was a couple of years ago, but nonetheless, I think something to be thinking about. And the key issue, as I mentioned at the outset of the presentation, is if you had a bad sequence of inflation in retirement, if inflation flares up early in your retirement, that it's just going to kind of build upon itself throughout your retirement. So think about this recent bout of inflation, for example, and what it's done for food prices and hotel prices and the whole gamut of things that we spend money on. Well, chances are we're not going to go back to sort of pre-2020 prices on things, right? We probably will just build off of today's higher prices. That yes, the rate of inflation may go down, but today's higher prices are probably here to stay. And that's a negative for retirees in that they are kind of stuck with whatever the prices are at the outset of their retirement. So it's a real consideration. I think that the recent bout of inflation illustrated the importance of thinking about inflation and making sure that portfolios and plans have good defenses against inflation. So just why it can be a big deal in retirement. I mentioned that this sort of snowball effect. Another key consideration is that when we look at a statistic called CPIE, which is a consumer price index for older adults, we see that spending patterns tend to be a little different than they are for the general population. Older adults spend less on gasoline, for example, because they're commuting less and a lot of different reasons. But older adults do spend more on healthcare than does the general population. And healthcare has historically, even though it's come down a little bit over the past decade, I think in part because of some changes in healthcare coverage. But inflation, nonetheless, in healthcare has tended to be higher than the general inflation rate over long periods of time. So that's a negative for retirees. They're contending with, generally speaking, higher inflation with a bigger share of their consumption basket. Another reason why inflation is such a big deal in retirement is that in contrast with when we're working, and typically our employer is trying to give us some inflation protection on an ongoing basis in terms of cost of living adjustments, when we're retired, yes, our Social Security will be inflation adjusted. We may be lucky enough to have a pension that provides an inflation adjustment. But if we are pulling from our portfolio, well, no one is helping make us whole with respect to inflation. So we've got to build in those inflation hedges in our portfolio. Another reason why inflation is such a big consideration in retirement and such a negative in retirement is that if we have our portfolio in non-equity investments, in cash and in fixed income investments, well, those are sort of nominal those are going to be paying us in nominal dollars. We're not getting any sort of inflation adjustment. And so inflation will take a bite out of the purchasing power that those investments buy us. So that's a reason to be cognizant of inflation and to build inflation into our retirement spending plans. So how to get that inflation protection? Well, it's not an easy problem, but a few things to think about at the portfolio level. As you think about the fixed income portion of the portfolio, you'd want to think about having inflation protected securities like Treasury inflation protected securities, like I bonds as a component of that fixed income portfolio. This is a real attraction to holding stocks as a portion of that portfolio because stocks are by no means a direct hedge against inflation. I mean, think about 2022. We had really high inflation. Stock returns were lousy. So not any sort of direct inflation hedge. But over time, stocks have been an asset class that have outrun inflation, that stock returns have historically been higher than inflation. It's not necessarily been the case with nominal bonds. Then there are other niche categories that you might consider as a component of your portfolio to help defend against inflation. So real estate securities historically stand up pretty well to inflation. And that's for an intuitive reason that when inflation is running high, that's often when landlords are able to push through rent increases. And as an owner of real estate, either directly or indirectly through REITs, you're able to participate in those gains. Commodities historically have done an okay job of defending against inflation. So in periods when inflation has run high, commodities have done pretty well. Commodities related equities have also done well. So like energy stocks, for example, in a period of high inflation, they've historically done pretty well. So you'd want to think about those things, the first two especially, as must-haves as a component of your retirement portfolio. Then at the plan level, you'd want to think about maximizing Social Security, which is important no matter what, but it has sort of an inflation hook to maximize Social Security because the greater payment that you receive for delaying Social Security also gets inflation adjustment, an inflation adjustment. So retirees got some nice inflation adjustments during this recent bout of inflation. Even if you were someone who was delaying Social Security, if you weren't currently receiving benefits from Social Security, the benefit that you would eventually receive when you claim benefits would embed those inflation adjustments that people who were already getting benefits took advantage of. So just kind of a feather in the cap of that idea of delaying, especially if you have above average life expectancy, and then factoring in inflation into your portfolio spending plan. So you want to make sure that you're giving yourself leeway to pay for goods and services as they inevitably inflate over that 20 or 30 year or even longer period over your retirement time horizon.
There's two questions. I'm not
sure.
certain. I'm sorry I missed the CPI for retirees. CPI-E question mark?
Yes, so there is a statistic. It's I don't know if the Bureau of Labor Statistics is still calling it experimental, but it's a statistic that it's been preparing where it takes the consumption basket of older adults and uses that to kind of gauge, well, what is the inflation experience for older adults? And that consumption basket looks a little bit different. You can find the data on the BLS website. CPI-E is the statistic. One thing that had been kind of kicked around was whether that should be used to calculate Social Security adjustments. I don't think that has yet happened, but it's something that's been under discussion. So yeah, it's an interesting statistic. And the key differential is that the healthcare outlay is higher for older adults for pretty intuitive reasons. Older adults tend to be heavier users of healthcare.
Second question was, is there a good reason to guarantee cash flow with an annuity?
Yeah, big important question. And this is a topic that we touch a little bit on in our research paper. So annuities are just such a broad basket that I think it's almost like one of those terms that's not that helpful, because under the same umbrella you have very basic, plain vanilla instruments that it's a contract with an insurance company, and the insurance company sends you a stream of income for the rest of your life. Those products are generally pretty low cost, pretty transparent, easy to comparison shop. Those are good products, I think. There are a couple negatives, which I'll discuss in a sec. But under the same umbrella, you also have these really complicated, costly, variable type products that are harder to understand, harder to comparison shop. My bias is more with the former category, the just very simple vanilla products where you're getting this stream of income through your whole life. I think that they can be nice additions to augment maybe Social Security. So if you're kind of looking at your household budget at the outset of retirement and thinking about, well, how do we just make sure that our base expenses are covered, our food, our whatever housing costs we have, our taxes, perhaps our healthcare outlays. If you can line those up with those fixed sources of income, I think that that can be really, really attractive. And it can also, kind of give you comfort with the rest of your portfolio, maybe being positioned a little bit more aggressively, and there'll be some volatility there. And, maybe you can be a little bit more flexible in terms of your portfolio withdrawals because your fixed expenses are kind of locked down. But a couple of big caveats with even the really good kind of basic annuity types that I just talked about. One is that you can't currently buy any annuities that are linked to CPI. So you're not necessarily going to be made whole with respect to inflation. You can add inflation riders to annuities, but you'll pay for them in the form of lower payments from the annuity. So that's a trade-off. I'm not an annuity expert, but annuity people I've discussed this with in the past have said that often the trade-off isn't that great of adding that inflation rider, that the payout is reduced so much that you might as well just take the higher payout and assume that the purchasing power is going to be gobbled up. And then the other big caveat is that annuities are not guaranteed. So while they are backed by state insurance funds, state guarantee associations, they are not, fully guaranteed. And so you're taking some risk by essentially casting your lot with the insurance company and assuming that the insurance company is going to continue to be able to make these payments to people. So those are a couple big caveats. I'll touch lightly on the qualified longevity annuity contract that someone mentioned. It's a little different from the fixed immediate annuities that I just mentioned. This is a contract where you can take a portion of your IRA and send it to an insurance company or sign a contract with an insurance company. The amount that you put into the QLAC, and it's kind of a sliding scale that I believe is like in the neighborhood of 140, 150,000. In 2024, it may have gone a little higher. The amount that you can put in the QLAC is deemed to satisfy required minimum distributions. So it kind of comes out of the RMD calculation, but it's a deferred annuity. So a typical formula would be you buy the annuity at age 65, but benefits don't commence until, say, age 85. And you might say, well, why would I want to do that? And the main benefit of doing that is that it buys you some certainty around your planning horizon. So you can say, well, I know with some certainty that my portfolio will take me through, say, 20 or 25 years of retirement. After that, if I live to be 100 or something like that, I'm a little nervous about my portfolio's ability to last during that period. The deferred annuity, whether a qualified longevity annuity contract or just a straightforward deferred annuity, is a way of kind of buying yourself that longevity protection against a very long life and sort of outliving your portfolio. So something to get maybe some advice on, I would say maybe, engage with a financial planner just on a consultation. And here I mean a financial planner who is a fiduciary who is not selling annuities. You want to make sure to disentangle any sort of sales relationship or any sort of commission from this engagement. You'd want to just engage with like an hourly CFP on whether this makes sense given your situation. So get some advice before proceeding because a lot of questions there. In the interest of time, I'm just going to kind of speed through these next few slides, if that's okay, and then we'll tackle any questions that remain, and then I think we're going to take a break. So I mentioned that retirees' own spending tends to vary across the life cycle. This is some research that was prepared by Wade Pfau, as well as David Blanchett, my former colleague at Morningstar, prepared some research that looked at actual retiree spending using actual data. And what he found was a pattern that he eventually kind of shorthanded as the retirement spending smile. So the basic idea is that he found that spending was not static over the life cycle, but instead took a pretty big dip starting in sort of around age 80. And then for some retirees trended up later in the life cycle, in part because of uninsured long-term care costs. So that's a pattern that we actually incorporated into our own research when we did our retirement spending research in 2023. We actually looked at these actual spending patterns and incorporated that and said, okay, so what if we don't assume that the retiree is just taking the same inflation adjusted amount year in and year out of the portfolio? What if we incorporate a pattern kind of along these lines? And what we came away with was an interesting conclusion that the retiree using the assumption that spending would decline throughout retirement could take more from that portfolio. So here I would call your attention to this second column, starting safe withdrawal percentage. And then we're going to look at that actual spending line. So that looks at actual retiree spending patterns. You can see that if you incorporate that slope, that downward trend in spending, that you're actually able to take a higher starting safe withdrawal percentage than that 4% base case at the top of the slide. So that's kind of an interesting finding. But the key is that you need to be okay with the trade-off of that, right? That if you are taking more at the outset of retirement to kind of coincide with the go-go years, the feeling good, good health, maybe heavy travel plans, whatever the case might be, you can definitely take more in those early years of retirement, but you have to be okay with this idea that you'll take less as your retirement goes on. And you'd also want to be thinking about, well, if I have not insured against long-term care expenses, what is my plan? Do I have, kind of a segregated bucket for long-term care expenses? You'd want to make sure to have some type of long-term care plan, not necessarily insurance, but at least some part of your portfolio carved out to defend against those potential expenses. So kind of some interesting food for thought in terms of actual retiree spending. Lesson 5, I just want to hit on because this was a big component of our research where we looked at some of these flexible strategies for retirement spending. And the basic idea is, even though there are different systems in place, the basic idea is that you're saying, well, I'm not just going to take blindly the same amount out of my portfolio year in and year out. I'm actually going to pay attention to how my portfolio has performed, how it has behaved, and use that to determine how much I can take out each year. So I might sort of set a baseline at the outset of my retirement, but from year to year, I'm going to take a step back at the end of each year, the beginning of the following year, and think about, well, what's gone on in my portfolio in the previous year, and use that to inform how much I can safely take out. So, going back to 2022, for example, at the end of 2022, you might, if you're using one of these variable systems, you might say, okay, everything in my portfolio is down. My plan is for 2023, I'm going to be safe about my withdrawals. I'm going to take less from my portfolio because I want to leave my portfolio to repair itself in the years ahead. I want to take out the least amount that I can, and that gives more of my portfolio a chance to rebound. So that's the basic kind of concept in play with these variable strategies. We tested several of them. We tested a simple kind of RMD type strategy, which is just the portfolio balance each year divided by life expectancy, and you use that to determine how much you can take out. We used what's been called the guardrail system, which was developed by Jonathan Guyton and William Klinger, which is a little bit more complex, but annually looks at the portfolio and attempts to steer withdrawals in one direction or another. The idea of the guardrails is that in a good year, it limits how high those withdrawals can go, and in a bad year, it limits how low they can go. So the basic intuition there is to kind of preserve the retiree's kind of quality of life by putting those guardrails around the withdrawals. And then we also looked at just a real simple system that in a year after the portfolio has encountered a loss, the retiree forgoes the inflation adjustment in the subsequent year. So we tested these different withdrawal strategies, and what we found is that there are some trade-offs, that generally they do nudge up the starting safe withdrawal percentages. So really across the board relative to our base case, if you're willing to take some variability into account, you can have a starting safe withdrawal percentage that is higher. One trade-off that should be discussed, though, is that the balance at the end of a 30-year time horizon would tend to be lower with these variable strategies, because basically they get you to spend more of your portfolio in good years. That's not something that's happening if someone's just taking a fixed real withdrawal year in and year out. And then the variable strategies just inherently buffet you around a little bit. That year 30 cash flow standard deviation column is capturing just the volatility in cash flows. So some retirees might say, I'm not comfortable at all with variability in my cash flows. I'm not willing to make any adjustments to my spending. I want my spending to be what it is, and I don't want to make any changes. Some retirees might say, I'm perfectly comfortable making those adjustments. So it really depends on the individual. And I think it depends on, sort of what your working income looked like. If you're someone who had a lot of stability in your paycheck, you probably may be less comfortable with that variability in your cash flows from your portfolio. But definitely some trade-offs to consider. I mentioned lifetime withdrawal rates are higher when you use these variable strategies. It encourages you to spend more of your portfolio during your lifetime. And by the way, I should say, spending doesn't mean on yourself necessarily. Spending can be lifetime giving, which I think is such an important dimension of this, giving money to your kids and your grandkids in, at a time of their lives when you can really maybe make a difference, versus when they inherit money from you in their 50s or 60s or something like that. So I think sometimes spending gets a bad rap. It's not, saying you're going to buy a new car every year or go out to dinner every night. It's maybe spending on people you love. So the volatility in the paydays, the volatility in cash flows is something that each of us needs to gauge when deciding whether something like this is appropriate. And then ending balances tend to be lower. That base case, you can see, especially for very high equity weightings, did tend to have the greatest amount of leftovers at year 30, whereas these other strategies had fewer leftovers. So for someone who really is prioritizing a bequest, you'd want to be maybe steering toward a base case style spending where you're being a little bit more conservative about your spending in exchange for, in many situations, in many market environments, you would have significant sort of assets left over at the end of your life. So just a little bit of information about where you can find me. My email address is here. I can't answer anyone's personal financial planning questions. I'm on Twitter. I'm on LinkedIn. I do co-host a weekly podcast with which Lynn mentioned. And then there's a link to the research paper that I've referenced in this in this slide deck as well. So I will just pause there. I think we're going to take a short break.
Do you want to answer the questions first?
Sure. Let's do that.
Okay, go ahead.
Stop my share here unless people want to try to, does anyone need this screen any longer? I'll stop the share.
Okay. Would the annuity, I'm assuming QLAC, reduce your Medicare Part B premiums if you were at a higher rate?
This takes me out of my pay grade a little, or it's above my pay grade. I would get some financial planning guidance. I am not an expert in the Medicare related taxes and the IRMA.
Is the SMILE for a couple on one or one on one person? It's capitalized. I'm not certain what it means.
So the Spending Smile is really something, some data that my former colleague David Blanchett ran on all of retirees. So it wouldn't matter couple or single individual. The general spending pattern would be the same. One sort of punctuation that I would make on the whole thing, though, is that in talking to David, healthcare expenses don't go up for everyone in those later years of retirement. It's mainly the fact that you have some older adults that have uninsured, catastrophic long-term care costs that drive up those costs kind of for everyone. I would say it maybe over accentuates the healthcare expenses later in life because many people will sail along with no long-term care outlays at all, certainly no paid ones. So it's very idiosyncratic. It depends on the individual. It certainly would depend on, how you're situated with respect to long-term care. If you're someone who has long-term care insurance, you certainly would be better. Your risks would definitely be better addressed through that. So I don't know that it makes sense for everyone to assume that they'll have this increase in healthcare costs, because in reality, I think it's just about 50% of the population has some sort of paid long-term care need later in life.
Higher for women than men.
It is very, very much so. Important point. Women are oftentimes the caregivers for their partners, and because women outlive men by a couple of years on average, women don't have that same, in-home person to care for them. So women do tend to have a higher long-term care outlays.
Is the withdrawal rate pre or post-tax?
So we do not factor in taxes in the withdrawal rate research that we do. So and the reason is that the character of people's retirement portfolios is so different. I think increasingly we'll be having people carrying bigger shares of their portfolio in Roth accounts, which are really good from the standpoint of in retirement withdrawals. So we don't factor in taxes. So if you are, if we're saying that a 4% withdrawal rate is safe and your whole portfolio is in a traditional tax deferred account, well, you'd need to haircut that amount accordingly because you've got to factor in taxes.
Okay. What about the order of withdrawal? Taxable, traditional, and Roth?
I would say this is a great spot to get some help because it really depends on the complexion of the retirement portfolio. The sort of standard formula that you hear about is get rid of taxable first, then move on to traditional tax deferred, leave Roth until last. And the basic idea there is that you want to deplete the least tax-friendly assets first, but there are some wrinkles there. Long-term assets qualify for capital gains treatment. There may be reasons to actually accelerate withdrawals from traditional tax deferred accounts, especially in the pre-RMD years. So because it is so idiosyncratic, I really would urge people to get some help either from a financial planner or a tax savvy financial advisor, or a tax advisor. CPAs, in my experience, don't typically weigh in on this kind of thing, but maybe your tax advisor can help.
Do we have time to cover the last two questions, which are regarding slides 8 and 9?
Sure.
Okay. Want to share the slides?
Okay, sure.
The question on slide 9 was, can you explain the left-hand column, what the left-hand column stands for? I don't understand the chart. Are these rolling returns over time?
Okay, so I think we are talking about
This should be this
this
one.
one.
Okay.
Yeah, so the left-hand slide on the screen is depicting a retiree with a 50/50 stock bond portfolio, $500,000 portfolio, 5% withdrawal rate, retiring in 1972. And I mentioned a lot went wrong for that retiree early on. Bad sequence of returns, right? Which is something we want to try to protect against with our retirement plan. So high inflation, higher interest rates that hurt bond prices, bad equity shock early on. So right out of the box, the spending was too high. The 5% withdrawal rate was too high. The right-hand side of the screen is a hypothetical where we flip the sequence of returns. So the really good returns that happened in the late 1980s, early 1990s, they're right at the beginning. And then the retiree sails on, has great returns, and then encounters those same bad market conditions at the tail end of the tail end of this 20-year period. Didn't matter, right? That bad sequence happened later, so the retiree was basically safely out of the woods. Since the bad returns occurred early on and the good ones occurred later, the portfolio increased nicely, and so it didn't disrupt that retiree's ability to continue spending at that 5% rate because the portfolio had grown. The reality was the left-hand side of the screen, but many periods look more like the right-hand side, right? Even the retiree, say retiree retiring in the early 1990s through the past couple of decades would have had a pretty good experience because they had great returns in the 90s, not so great returns in the 2000s, but then better later on. So it really is just luck of the draw, the specific sequence that occurs during our own 20 or 30-year time horizon. Does that answer the question?
That answers one of the questions. The next one is the next slide.
Okay.
Why are there two scales on the horizontal axis and just asking for an explanation of the left-hand.
So what we're looking at here is each little dot on each of these graphs is the pinpoint starting withdrawal percentage that would have been supported over the subsequent 30-year period. So, I mentioned that sort of late 1940s period. You can see where that dark blue line goes high, in fact, goes above 10%. If you had that 75-25 portfolio, that's because sort of coming out of the post-war period, everything was booming in the US, and it was a very good time to have been a stock investor. So a 10% starting withdrawal percentage would have been supported over that 30-year time horizon. And same goes for, kind of at the far right-hand side of the screen where you had the retiree in the early 1980s, for example, beginning of a great bull run for stocks that lasted a couple of decades until 2000. And so that was another great period to have retired into where the market conditions were such that it would have supported a very high starting withdrawal rate, especially for that very stock heavy portfolio. So does that make sense? Each of these points is looking at a particular starting year and a particular starting withdrawal percentage that would have been supported for a given stock bond allocation.
The one remaining question, is there 10 more years of data to add to the right side?
Yes, and I need to get to that, but I haven't updated the slide.
There's a request to redisplay the link slide, the last slide you had up.
Oh, sure.
We can leave it up during the break.
And I would say a shorthand with that research paper is just type in whatever search engine you use, Morningstar State of Retirement Income. And I noticed that this version came up. I think it was the second link that came up in my search, and it's ungated, so you don't need to enter any personal information. You don't need to enter your email. You should be able to access it right from there.
Okay. Should we take the 10-minute break now, Lynn?
Yep, let's do the 10-minute break now.
Great. Thank you.